Welcome to a sports betting podcast from pregame.com for the week of September 23rd, 2009. I'm your host, RJ Bell. I'm joined by Marco D'Angelo, 30 years in the business, Vegas runner, a genuine professional bettor right here in Las Vegas. Now, this is segment 2 of 5, and we are talking about, the subject is college polls and the meaning of them, the rankings for the bettor. All right, Vegas runner, just off the top, what strikes you about the polls? Now we're headed in week 3 here, and what does it mean to a bet?
As a handicapper, it plays a role, and it's very significant because even though a lot of times the coaches or the players say the right things, they're human beings, and they're taking a look at these polls. And although the season goals, the long-term goals doesn't change for each team, they want to win, I think the short-term goal changes from game to game until there's a playoff system. Without a playoff system, every game's significant, and margin of victory becomes significant. So I think week by week, these coaches have to take it into consideration, especially of these elite programs.
So what you're saying is if a team is, let's say, doing poorly in the polls, or let's say below their expectations, they're thinking, oh, if we run it up and we have style points, then we might do better next week.
Right, even though they're reaching their long-term goal of winning, they might be 3-0, but they're not advancing in the polls. So the short-term goal needs to change, which is we need to be more impressive. We got to win more impressively because no one's paying attention to it.
Which, when that seems, Marco, to be most significant is when you have a big favorite that is motivated to win big.
Absolutely. And a case in point this week, and I will say with the polls, this will become a bigger factor as we move later in the season, as they start to jockey for the BCS positioning, because that's the key to get yourself into the national championship picture. But this past week, Ohio State, not to pick on your guys, but they won 38-0 and they dropped in the polls. You can't tell me that team this week doesn't have a chip on their shoulder. Like, what do we got to do? You know, we went out and took care of business. So it does invite coaches to run the scores up, which I don't like. But you have to factor that in your handicapping.
I think you also got to look at, too, what kind of team you're dealing with, and can they handle this kind of pressure. Just because they need to win by a big margin and they are a top 10 school, don't mean they're capable of going out there and doing it. Because right now, that's extra pressure on you.
Hold on. When we have a team which is a 25-point or more underdog, or, you know, a favorite in the flip side, the other team, isn't it almost always, not always, but 80+% of the time about the intention or the agenda of the dominant team? Like, if you're playing basketball against an 8-year-old kid, you can beat them as bad as you want.
Right.
With the big favorites, isn't that almost always the case?
Yeah. Well, how are they going to approach this game? Do they want to keep scoring, or if they take a 3-touchdown lead, are they going to run out the clock?
Exactly, or put the second team in.
Right.
So I agree with you. If a team's laying 10, they might not be capable of being quote-unquote impressive. But if a team, once they get past 3 touchdowns, not all the time, but most of the time, they cannot name the score, but they can decide through their effort the likelihood of winning by more than 21.
I agree.
So I think your point's correct on the tighter lines, but on these jumbo lines, it really is about motivation. And it seems to me you guys make a great point that if a team is underappreciated in the polls, or it's getting late in the season and it's about jockeying for that final position, you gotta apply the idea that this dominant team is going to be motivated to run the game up.
They are. I mean, and again, last year, if you remember at the end of the season in the Big 12, when you had Oklahoma and Texas and, and Texas Tech, jockeying those final couple weeks for the position of who was going to come out of there, it became a factor. They were literally, Oklahoma made no bones about it.
Right.
They were going to run the score up. They never took their foot off the gas pedal in the fourth quarter, and they just couldn't set the lines high enough.
And that's another example of old school wise guys versus new school wise guys. Is old school always loved taking the big points, but now you got to consider this motivation of the blowout.
And some of those old school guys are smart enough to make adjustments. You notice he always looks at me when he goes old school?
Well, I actually look up at your hair, typically.
Or lack of it.
You brought up a great point, not to harp on last season, but that was a great example last year, the Texases and the Oklahomas, where the old school, new school wise guys were battling week in week because old school, when you see a total of 70, they bet it under right away. But the new school wise guys were like, let these old guys bet it under for us, let them take it down to 66, and come Saturday they were blasting it back up to almost 70 again because of the teams having to blow, the other team out. And I think RJ's right. When you got a 20-point favorite and you're taking the dog, you're thinking, are they going to try to blow me out? You're not thinking this team's going to win.
I mean, you have two ways to win. One is your team can do very well and surprise the heck out of you, or they can do bad, but still the second team, they run the ball late, the opponent, and you still cover. That doesn't happen as much anymore. Now, another thing that strikes me is when I looked at the polls this week was Mississippi being at number 4. And I think this is an example of that this early in the year, you have a handful of teams that were highly regarded entering the year, and they haven't played anyone yet, but just by attrition, just by the USCs and the high states that have lost, is they've moved up, 4, 5, 6 rankings, and now you got a team like Mississippi, which is totally untested, which has a number 4 beside them. Now, it strikes me, an open question, there's got to be some value with these handful of teams that are so highly ranked and so untested, where the public is just giving them more credit right now, and going against might have value.
I think 100% there is. On them sexy teams that were hyped all summer, the Mississippi was talked about all summer, how what are the chances of possibly even winning the SEC. They were the team that beat Florida last year. And you're right, they've done absolutely nothing to get up to number 4, except that teams above them lost last week.
Yet a team like Miami of Florida has been ultra impressive in their 2 games thus far. Both of them were on national TV, so everybody got to see them. Yet they just got themselves into the top, 10 because they weren't on the radar at the beginning of the season. They
Not even with the odds makers were they on the radar. So, I mean, that's the kind of that's value if you're able to uncover a squad like Miami before even the odds maker had any idea. Miami was in nobody's poll to start the season. And even up to last week, they didn't even hardly make any of the polls or even the odds maker gave them no
Now,
respect.
Vegas did like, and I agree with you 100%, Vegas did like Miami on future bets. It's interesting. I did an article at Pregame Blogs, and you can go there directly at pregameblogs.com, is Miami was had the 15th best odds to win the national title, but they weren't even ranked in the top 25. So, and then some of that could have been the marquee name of Miami of Florida still carried weight. What's interesting is Mississippi, who's now number 4, did not even have individual odds. So there were 63 teams that had individual odds to win it, and Mississippi wasn't one of them. Mississippi was in the field, and Miami wasn't, but now Mississippi's number 4. So Vegas early in the year was saying, we don't think this Mississippi team is real.
One of the points, though, too, is for Mississippi to win a national title, they had to go through the odds-on favorite to win the title, because, I mean, they're in the same conference
There are
as
a couple
Florida.
of them in that SEC.
And they have now Alabama, too.
But if they're the 4th best team, it should be a good game.
Well, I don't think they're the 4th best team.
I think there's value in fading teams like that. I really do.
Now, last subject is the keep up with the whole old school wise guy, new school wise guy, is the odds makers have gotten smarter. Sometimes we're critical here and a lot of conversation about how good the odds really are. But let's look at this Southern Miss team. They're playing Kansas. Now, Kansas has been impressive, but they started the season not even in the top 25. Southern Miss has the second longest win streak in college football, but they're traveling, and you've been hearing second longest win streak this week in the press. They're getting almost two touchdowns at Kansas. So though you can find those 2 or 3 point edges, and that's how you win the 55% to really grind out Vegas, but the fact is it's not like the old days where when something was just obvious that in the old days that Kansas line might have been 7 or even less.
Well, one of the things, and to use a horse racing term here, Southern Miss is stepping way up in class. I mean, you're going into a Big 12 school, and there's just such a difference between the Big 12 conference and Southern Miss's conference.
I think it's also. I'm
gonna have to stop us. I'm sorry, we have our time constraints. All right, good stuff. Next up is going to be our big game preview for the biggest college football game of the week. And remember, you can actually watch all of our videos at pregame.tv, or if you want to listen, go to iTunes and search for pregame.com.